want to do, okay, now it's recording, so I want to do schermo intero, condividi anche l'audio. All right, and now it's actually recording, and we'll see what it does. Basically we are experimenting. So, just to pick up from where we left off. So we're dealing with a cognitive architecture for language production that accounts for how humans speak, how they go from having an idea to actually planning all the way down to the details of what turns out into a plan for articulation. And that the cognitive models that psycholinguists, whether they're working with one language, bilinguals, or in fact interpreting, they sort of have this idea of it's called a cognitive architecture. It's basically saying, what is our mind doing when? And the understanding is that this is about how humans comprehend and produce language. And that ultimately, our mind does these operations. It's kind of the analogy is the hardware and the software. So the software is the cognitive architecture. Okay, so when you do Word, whether you do it in a Windows or a PC, Windows system or a Mac system, but then the computers may be different. Okay, so this type of description is at the level of the software. What is our mind doing? And then, of course, this also relies on more and more of what we know about what the brain is also doing. Okay, so we said that there's also an area that goes down to the brain level mechanisms. And so some of the evidence that we alluded to, which is speech error evidence, we'll see tip of the tongue evidence and experimental evidence, have together brought psycholinguists to believe that formulation, coming up with an utterance to express a meaning, is actually a multi-level process. It's staged. There are separate stages that deal with specific types of information. Because we are talking about speaking, we start from meaning, a conceptual, an idea. And in your notes, when you take notes for consecutive, that's those symbols that you use to represent the message. You have a message that's not in language, okay? Psychologists and philosophers and computer scientists, there's a whole area looking at what does this language of thought look like, okay? Does it have spatial information and so on? How is it? How do we represent knowledge of everything that we know? But then when we encode it into language, certain steps take place. And these, in theories, psycholinguistic theories, there's a big distinction based on evidence between those grammatical properties, abstract properties of words, which are called lemmas in this literature. So the lemma for the word cat is something in Italian, it would be noun, so grammatical category, nouns and verbs. So for Italian, it would be gatto, noun, but there would be, and it would also say masculine, for example. And then there would also be a specification for the lemma in Italian that the speaker knows that you also have to select number. Okay? And then the lexeme is the phonological spell out. So the lemma that has no phonological information. It actually points to the phonology. It's linked. It sends activation to the lexeme, but crucially, it's not the same representation. Why? Well, we know this from observed phenomena when speakers speak. Sometimes they get the phonology wrong, or maybe they can't retrieve the phonology, but you know that they know the word. Why? Because they can tell you, for example, now gatto is unlikely that you would have experienced a tip of the tongue state when you're talking about concrete words and you're speaker who's, under normal circumstances, you're more likely to have a tip of the tongue state for a word that's low frequency and abstract, okay? But it is conceivable. Tip of the tongue states can also happen for other reasons. For example, you have another representation that is highly active and it's kind of suppressing the one that you're trying to retrieve. And in fact, when you're in a tip of the tongue state, it's very frustrating because you know the word. It's a temporary experience. And often, if people ask you, how many syllables is that word, you are actually able to say that. Sometimes you know that it has an L or an F or something like that, right? So you have partial access to a representation, the phonology of which is temporarily blocked or unaccessible. So that's another source of evidence. We said speech errors, but also tip of the tongue states. And we'll see today that tip of the tongue states, you can observe them as they happen, when they happen. In normal speakers, you can also study them in people who've had a brain insult and who have developed a condition called anomia. So anomia means an impairment in retrieving words. And at the same time, you can ask them, well, okay, you can't name this object, but is it masculine or feminine, say gender? And the person actually, above chance, can tell you it's masculine or feminine, or it's mass or count. So partial access to information about this representation. Okay, so these different types of sources of evidence, including experimental evidence that we'll address next week, not today, have led to positing this cognitive architecture, where you have meaning, then you've got this step where you select the right lemmas, and the lemmas are abstract, okay? They're not, gatto doesn't have g, a, t on it. It's just saying, okay, I exist in the lexicon of Italian to express that concept. And those lemmas have activation. It's not all or nothing. Partial activation to potential candidate lemmas. So if I were to say gatto, or I show you a picture of a cat, and you're all multilingual speakers, all of your potential candidate lemmas in all the languages you know will actually have some activation, including synonyms. Okay, so if you see a picture of gatto, it'll activate cat, it'll activate maybe gattino or kitten, but also things that are semantically related. Okay, so domestic animal, feline also, because you could in fact activate, you could name something using a superordinate label. Okay, so a cat is an example of a feline. Okay, so, or a pet. So multiple concepts activate multiple lemmas, and what's happening in our minds, ultimately we have to select one among competing candidates. And sometimes the competing candidate may receive more activation for just part of how the system works, and therefore you may say the wrong word. Okay, you might actually make sort of a substitution error. Okay, so these kinds of sources of evidence, like from word exchange errors and from tip of the tongue states and from experiments and brain imaging, all point to the fact, to this positing that in fact the way we store words in our heads is in a way that separates the sort of syntactic, semantic properties from the phonology. And the phonology is actually dealt with in a separate stage, which is called positional processing, where you spell out the segments in a word, and that's also where you begin to linearize, to come up with a sequence of the actual sequence of words and the sequence of sounds for the linearized output. Because at the end of the day, when you speak, there's time, it's a timing issue. There's a word you say first, there's a word you say second. Even if you plan them not sequentially, the output has to be linearized, okay? And that's different from comprehension, because comprehension, you're processing something that's coming in, kind of a linearized sequence, but you're constructing a message that isn't linearized. In fact, when you take your notes for interpreting, you're not doing a linearized thing. You're coming up with a schematic visual representation of conceptual relationships in the message. Okay, so you're using kind of the same system for different directions, and the pressures that you have, the difficulties that you have for each task is slightly different. For sure, in production, timing and getting the order right is important. Because if you get the order wrong, sometimes you could get the meaning wrong. Okay, if you say the cat chased the rat or the rat chased the cat, those things mean very, very different semantics. So next week I will also present from the chapter written by two pioneering psycholinguists, we said, Bach and De Welt. Okay, and it's a very dense, difficult chapter to read unless you've already kind of become familiar with the more sort of the simple language, relatively simple language that the Paul Martin book uses. So it's an example of showing now you're going into some very technical, very dense chapter, but you already have the building blocks to understand what they're talking about. So this picture is taken from the chapter that summarizes a lot of what we've done. Okay, so message and the stage processes, and then we said yesterday that there's a question that concerns information flow, like activation, and we will challenge this model partly from evidence that comes from speech errors, suggesting that in fact, yes, you have stages, okay, these are separate aspects of what the system is doing, but that in fact activation, there's reason to believe that in our minds activation can also come back up from the phonology to selection of the lemma. And that evidence comes from mixed errors. So the probability of making an error that's both semantic and phonological. Our favorite example, saying rat instead of cat, because rat has phonological overlap and semantic overlap with cat, is actually greater, and this is computer simulations that have done this, looking at the probability of errors occurring in naturalistic corpora, and building a computational model that simulates the error rate, assuming that this type of architecture, the one direction, versus one where you also allow for activation to come back. The results of the simulations actually show that to account for human errors, you need to assume a system that's interactive. Okay, now this might not sound like a big deal to you, but it kind of is a big deal because it means that there's things on, so a modular stage system is in some ways a system that is less prone to error because you have one stage has to finish and it's not influenced by the following stages. Interaction means you're also now influenced not only by the lemma selection but also by the phonology. So it's a system that is more error prone, but at the same time is a system that allows you in comprehension to make use of all possible sources of information. Okay, so there's advantages and disadvantages to different types of architecture. Okay, and the models, sort of the large language models and the things that we'll be talking about next semester, you'll see that some of those models are similar to the models that psycholinguists developed, neural network models to account for human behavior. Okay, so the topics kind of intersect. We're interested in how humans do it in this class, to understand how speakers' minds work, comprehenders' minds work, and how our own minds work when we encode meaning into language. So we said the speech error evidence of the distinction between the moment when you select the lemma and you assign the lemma to grammatical functions. For example, the decision, implicit decision sometimes that you make between choosing a passive and an active sentence. So in English and in Italian, what a passive sentence does is it promotes the patient to subject. So the subject becomes the grammatical subject of the clause And in Italian and English, that means that it occurs initial. Okay, so you're doing patient to grammatical subject mapping. Now, saying, I'm using a simple example of the cat chased the rat, or the rat was chased by the cat. In terms of what's happening, the cat is always the agent and the rat is always the patient, okay? But when you turn it around and the function of the passive is to highlight, put emphasis on the patient, okay? And that's something in discourse we're often interested in, for example, introducing an element as a topic, and then you want to, topic continuity, you want to continue referring to that entity in the subject position. And also the discourse function of a passive is also if you want to not mention the agent. Okay, so there are discourse functions of passives, but that's a kind of operation that you're doing at the level of function assignment. Function assignment, that's when that happens in the mind of the speaker. And there are multiple factors that influence what function you're going to assign. Okay, so if something is given, topical, or it's been mentioned before, or it is more accessible from your own memory, you'll tend to put it into subject position. You'll retrieve it first. And in languages like Italian and English, that also means in the output sentence, it will come first. Okay? So examples of, we said function assignment, errors tell us again that this is a stage when you're basically mapping meaning onto grammatical relationships or onto syntax, the syntax of the language. And then you have those errors that are downstream in the model that have to do with phonological encoding. Okay, so that's why we believe that there's a distinction between functional processing, where you do letter selection, and function assignment, grammatical function assignment, and then phonological encoding, which happens at a later stage. Now, the chapter having to do that deals with formulation, which is chapter 2, the planning utterances, spends some time looking at the relationship between pause patterns, speakers' pauses, and aspects of how complex the utterance is. Okay, so complexity is a thorny question. It's like, well, complex, how do you measure complexity? Okay, so there's more than one way to measure complexity linguistically. And as theories of grammar or linguistic theories change, so do notions of complexity. Okay, so the relationship between linguistic complexity and how hard something is to understand and to produce is not one-to-one, it's not transparent. Okay, but it's interesting to look at where, based on the measurement of pause data, how long speakers pause, whether they actually line up with some basic notions of syntactic constituents. And this is interesting, for example, from the perception point of view, to figure out that when you have an ambiguous strain, which could be syntactically ambiguous, pauses give you a cue. Okay, so speakers do this, and comprehenders can exploit the duration of those pauses to figure out what the meaning was. Okay, so if you look at, these are English examples. Okay, so the host expected Kate to be at breakfast versus the host persuaded Kate to be at breakfast. Okay, so here's the difference between verbs like expect and verbs like persuade. Now on the surface, here you've got the host expected, and then Kate, and then an infinitive. So on a surface analysis, these look similar, right? You've got subject, a verb, and then a subordinate, so another what looks like an object, and an infinitive. but they mean two different things, and syntactic analyses, in fact, propose a different type of representation. And here I use bracket notation. Okay, so you can see the meaning of the host expected Kate to be at breakfast. The meaning is that the host expected the whole event, Kate to be at breakfast. Okay, it doesn't mean the host expected Kate. Okay, the host is not expecting Kate. The host is actually expecting the whole event, right? And this is why it's bracketed in bracket notation. And then in the second one, the host persuaded Kate to be at breakfast. In fact, now Kate is the object of persuade. Okay, so it's the host persuaded Kate, and then Kate to be at breakfast. Okay, so that's subtle. They mean two different things. And lo and behold, when you do this in an experimental, the kind of task you would do this, you would actually record people to read these sentences and then measure the pauses. Okay? And it turns out that studies like this have shown that for English, so this is studies done back in the 70s, okay, Cooper, who did a lot of this pioneering early work on the relationship between pauses and linguistic complexity. And back in those days, there was an interest like a scientific interest in seeing how much linguistic complexity lined up with speaking complexity, okay? So some of the interpretation of this has changed, but the facts, like the findings, are still there. What Cooper found was that measuring lengthening in different conditions was that expected was longer in 1A when it was the host expected, where Kate is part of the event, Kate to be at breakfast. Now, 2A serves as a control condition. Okay, so what you notice here is some of those elements of experimental design, right? Where you want to have, remember when I said class 1 in experiments, you have to construct things so that you're only varying one thing at a time, and you have a control condition. Okay, so in this study, the control condition was 2A, where Kate is the object, okay, and all the words look, they're kept as close as possible, except for the thing that you're interested in changing. And then 1B, the host persuaded Kate, and then to be at breakfast also had its own control condition. The host persuaded Kate at the big breakfast. So these conditions are matched. They have as much as possible, same frequency, same words, everything like this. And the finding is that the pausing was longer, as we said, in expected, like in 1A, where, why? Because there's a clause, a syntactic clause boundary. The linguistic analysis is the host expected Kate to be at breakfast. So speakers pause at constituent boundaries. That's the interpretation. Whereas for 1B, the host persuaded Kate to be at breakfast. Linguistic analysis posits here that there's an invisible, this little gap, simply means that Kate appears as a subject, okay, even if it's not pronounced. So there's something, the referent here, there's an empty position that we know because of our ability to understand language, that competence that we have, that Kate is in fact the silent subject of to be at breakfast, okay? So this would be an example of two things. One saying, well, speakers produce pauses at clause boundaries. Okay, so that's interesting, and comprehenders know this. It can help you understand. And then the second, less relevant if you're applying this, but to the relationship between syntactic complexity and how speakers speak. Okay, so the relationship between competence and performance. Can you actually say something about constituents based on an analysis of speech pausing? Now, here's an example, and this is one example. You've probably encountered this example of a syntactic ambiguity. So spoken language has multiple ambiguities, okay, at all levels, lexical, phonological, and including syntactic, okay? And, well, what cues do speakers and hearers use to disambiguate, okay? So if I say a sentence like, Sherlock looked at the spy with binoculars. What picture, okay, if you were to take notes, okay, how would you represent this? Sherlock looked at the spy with binoculars. What do you interpret this as meaning?
Sherlock is the subject.
Yes,
Looked, the verb.
yes,
The spy is the object.
yes, the patient, I mean the theme, yes. And what about with binoculars? Okay, what does with binoculars modify?
It's like the meaning that it is.
Okay, so you're saying it's an adverbial modifier of the event, the verb. Okay, so Sherlock used binoculars to look at the spy. Okay, that's certainly, you know, you could say that's arguably the more plausible interpretation, that it's an instrument. Okay, is there another interpretation though?
The spy is holding the binoculars.
That's right. The spy is holding the binoculars. So in that case, it would be a modifier of the noun. Okay? So when you're taking notes, you have to disambiguate this. This is an example of a syntactic ambiguity. And here's a little picture. Okay, so Sherlock saw the man using binoculars versus Sherlock saw the man who was using binoculars. Okay? That's an example of attachment ambiguity. It's sort of saying, what does it modify? Is it when you draw a syntactic tree, is it a low attachment? Does it modify the man, or does it modify the whole clause? So is it an adverbial interpretation? Okay. Then there's also lots and lots of kinds of syntactic ambiguities, and in language comprehension studies, people have used ambiguities a lot to try to understand what types of sources of evidence do humans use when they compute meaning. What do they rely on? Syntactic analysis, plausibility, real-world meaning, right? There's multiple sources of information that humans actually can draw upon. Okay, so here's an example. Yeah. Yes.
The question of like, can also be related to the languages that
Yes, absolutely.
Some languages like the modifier is on.
Yes,
It's always
yes.
to the verb or.
yes, exactly. So there are different attachment. Thank you. That's a brilliant question. There are different attachment preferences between so-called low attachment and high attachment languages. So that's kind of something that's a language specific. Yeah. And it's interesting, there's a whole area of research that looks at what happens when you're bilingual, whether you modify them, whether you can prime them, if you've just processed something whether you can bias people to interpret one way or another, and it turns out that you can. So studies that have looked at priming, so where you are basically where you've used one interpretation, like low attachment or high attachment, you're more likely to reapply it. Okay, and you can also do it cross-linguistically. So there's some interesting. I had a student, an MA student, who actually did a project on that. She actually looked at this attachment preferences between English and German. And she looked at it cross-linguistically, going, seeing whether you could actually change it in the other language. So super interesting. Yes, the answer is it also depends on your other language, and not just like your L1, right? So you could say, well, I'm bringing in my preferences from my dominant or stronger language, but it also can change. Okay, so at high levels, you can change your attachment preferences based on exposure. Okay, so other examples of speech and syntactic and ambiguity. Now, this is an example of a temporary ambiguity, okay? Because this, for example, happens when we read. I'm sure you experience these garden path phenomena where you think when you're reading something and you interpret something as the object and then you realize, no, it wasn't the object. I have to go back and revise, okay? You all, I'm sure, have this experience. So while John was reading the book up, and I'm reading along, fell on his lap, okay? So what happened? Garden path, I'm thinking reading the book, obviously, nope, fell on his lap. Okay, and then you compare this to while John was reading the book, it fell on his lap. Now, these are production studies. So this is asking people to read sentences like this and see what they do as speakers. There's a flip side of this type of research that looks at what happens when you comprehend, right? Are you garden path always or not, and why? What does that mean? Okay, so Cooper and these early studies looked at pauses, and what they found again was that speakers unconsciously paused more, so longer pauses and what's called pre-pausal lengthening. So that means that you stretch out the word before the pause. For example, what's a pre-pausal lengthening? It could be while John was reading. Okay, that's the pre-pausal lengthening. I'm stretching out reading, basically. And then I do a pause. The book fell on his lap. Okay? So it's not literally just a pause. While John was reading, the book fell on his lap. So speakers will do this pre-pausal lengthening. Okay, the duration, you stretch out the previous. So while John was reading, the book fell on his lap. As opposed to while John was reading the book, something else happened, okay? While John was reading the book, it fell on his lap, okay? So again, you are you're kind of disambiguating the pauses. So what they found was that pauses align with linguistic constituent structure, and these prosodic cues, so pause is part of prosody, as is, lengthening and pitch changes, fundamental frequency, okay? So all of these prosodic cues are in fact used by the listener to come up with an interpretation, okay? So, remember yesterday we talked about pauses that have to do with, let's say, the difficulty of the task of speaking, so they reflect speaker internal issues, like lexical retrieval difficulty, reformulation, etc. These pauses are pauses that help the listener. These are actually ecological pauses. The first source is also ecological because they reflect what humans do when they speak, but these are the ones that are helpful to the listener. And again, studies that have looked at changes in pitch or fundamental frequency find that in fact you find falling pitch at the end of a constituent, typically, and then rising again at the beginning of, don't pause that mistake, beginning of the next constituent. Okay, so this is called continuation rise. So both rhythm and intonation serve as speech cues for listeners. And this, again, when you're listening to compute a meaning in your mind. Okay. So again, this is research done when there was like a great interest in aligning psycholinguistics and linguistics. Okay, so as I said, psycholinguistics and linguistics kind of deal with the same subject matter, language, but from slightly different points of view, and with sometimes a different interest. Okay, and as a linguist, I'm trained as a linguist, I'm interested in psycholinguistics being integrated with linguistics. and, because I think, and this is my personal, like, professional opinion, people can have a different opinion, that I believe that if you have a description of language in the mind that can also account for how we use it, how we comprehend and reproduce, that's actually beneficial. And that's different. I don't know how many of you have taken like syntax or theoretical linguistics, where sometimes that's not clear. Okay, it's not clear what that relationship is. And the second point of view, and this is slightly changing in linguistics, more linguists are actually doing experiments. Okay, I think that there's methodologically a lot to learn from the types of methods that come from the behavioral, like, so, sort of experimental sciences, both in terms of the methodology. Okay, and so the methodology from psycholinguistics is also very useful to people doing interpreting studies. And that's a general methodological issue of saying you don't want to just be anecdotal. You actually have to prove things, and to prove things, you need to do experiments. So that's what I think the contribution is. So what are connected speech phenomena? Okay, so if I say, who does Max want to leave? Or who does Max want to leave? What's the difference? So I say, who does Max want to leave? So here you have a WH question. So who does Max want to leave? Who do you want to leave? Who do you want to leave? Who do you want to leave behind? So you have a subject, you're leaving someone behind. Okay? So let's say you have, you have 2 cats, and you can only take one with you. Who do you want to leave behind? This one, do you want Fluffy or Whiskers? Or who do you want that person to leave? Okay, so in one case, again, if the object of leave is, if the object of leave is a person or the object, then you can do one contraction in English. Okay, but not in the other case. If the object is the whole clause, who does Max want that person to leave? Okay, not Max is leaving that person, then you cannot do this so-called wanna contraction in English. And again, studies that looked at this were interested in this phenomenon where spoken language aligned with syntactic analysis. So it was kind of like evidence for this type of analysis. Okay? All right, so there are, of course, we said, always pluses and minuses of any type of approach. Okay, so when we just looked at all of these studies of intonation and pausing with ambiguous sentences, these were actually reading tasks. They brought people into the lab and asked them to read. And so when you're reading something, that's actually quite different from planning an extemporaneous speech. Okay, so if you're reading, that's a it's still a speaking task, but it is a pretty different speaking, like the amount of planning that you do is different from spontaneous speech. Okay, so we said that different types of speeches actually have different cognitive demands and different linguistic demands. So that was just the end of this part of the chapter. And last week I threw in elements, even if I didn't say so, last week, I keep on saying last week, but it was actually yesterday, from finding words. Remember when we talked about finding words and lexical access, and we looked at some of the speech errors, okay? So the fact that we don't necessarily have the words available, we have to look for them in a competitive process, and that was, the evidence comes from speech errors, and we looked at some of these speech errors. But at the same time, not only are we having to find words, we're also, in fact, in production, building them. Okay, so words are not stored as like one piece. I have it all in one place. And the example yesterday was a nice example of when I made that speech error, when I said long lemma instead of wrong lemma. That's an example of what we mean for building words. I obviously knew that I wanted to say wrong. Wrong was the right lemma for the concept, and I had it planned, okay? But then when I phonologically encoded it, and so I was literally, in that sense, we're building it, okay? So those errors show you that you're actually, in fact, building them. This is the term that Paul Warren uses in this sense, okay, that your mind is actually building words. Okay, now the technical terms for building words are lexical retrieval and lexical assembly. Okay, that's the jargon, and Paul Warren uses the term building words. So building words has to do, we're still in the formulation stage, and formulation in this model includes grammatical encoding and phonological encoding, okay? So phonological encoding, this is still, we said, in the mind, it's not in the mouth. The mouth, when you're doing spoken speech, comes here, okay? So, and we'll see why we think when you do phonological encoding, you're actually still doing it in your mind. Okay, there's nothing overt. It's an abstract phonological representation that then needs to be turned into external speech. So I don't know if you've heard every once in a while advances in neuroprosthetics, so devices that can actually basically capture brain signals from your cortex and then externalize it to like an output device, and it's like, wow, how does that happen? Well, I mean, you ask somebody to imagine planning something that they're about to say, and if cortex is intact, you can actually read off those signals from saying, okay, imagine saying this word, and those signals are there in the right areas, right? So the external part is turning it into something that can either go down through your peripheral nervous system or in fact to something that's external, okay? So in that sense, phonology having, and you can also do brain imaging studies where you ask people to imagine words or say words and see what circuitry that is. So we're concerned in this class mostly for the production part only in the first two steps, going from generating the message, your notes if you're interpreting, and then to formulating grammatical encoding and phonological encoding. Okay, and this is again a picture taken from the Warren book from page 23, and it's showing you also where lemmas fit in. Okay, so our mental lexicon, we have evidence that we actually store the lemma and the lexeme as separate, they're connected via activation, and that the lemma partakes in lexical selection and function assignment. So lemmas can receive grammatical functions, subject, object, oblique, and then as a second step, you decide where they come in terms of linear order, and then lexemes are what comes out as the output of phonological encoding. So again, to use the example of the natural speech error that I produced yesterday, I had done lemma selection, and what went wrong was during phonological encoding at the lexeme, okay, because I said long instead of wrong. So the sources of evidence we said are observational, meaning how people pause, speech errors, and tip of the tongue states, and we will also examine experimental evidence, which I will show you next week. Okay, so all of this points to this view that language production is staged, even if it's something that we do effortlessly. And sometimes when you, when you ask people, so one of the most intuitive experiences, because sometimes when you ask people about speech errors, there's some ambiguity as to what you think you're asking about. Are you thinking about, second language errors or errors, that have to do with another type of error? But everybody has experienced the tip of the tongue state. It's usually an intuitive way to get you to think about, oh yes, I know what you're talking about. Okay, I know that a word exists. I have it on the tip of my tongue. Okay, so tip of the tongue (TOT) data reflect the fact that your semantic processing is intact. There's not a problem with your thinking. I know what I'm trying to say, but your phonological processing or access to the lexeme may be temporarily disrupted, okay? Because of competition, for example, or because you've selected the wrong lemma. And, okay, here's a little cartoon. How much for just the tip of the tongue? Wait, I know the answer. Oh, I almost had it. It's close. I'm so close. Okay, this is obviously a joke, but the cartoon of what the person is saying here, the butcher is saying, is phenomenologically describes what people experience in a tip of the tongue state. Oh, I've really got that name or that word, it's there, but I can't. It's so close. Okay, this experience of being close, but you can't get it. So you can study this naturalistically, either using a diary, and this suggests actually that tip of the tongue states are fairly frequent. They occur a few times a week. And then you can also induce tip of the tongue states by giving people a definition and asking to say what that instrument is. Okay, so, and then you ask people who are in a tip of the tongue state to say what you know about the word. Okay, so what's the first sound? How many syllables? Okay, and usually you can also ask the person if they have then resolved the tip of the tongue state. Okay, so if the word was later recalled. Okay, what is this? So it's an instrument that you use to measure angles. No, I think it's angles, something like that. An instrument to measure angles. Huh? Okay, so you give people definitions like this. I think this is a sextant. Okay, and then you say, oh, I know it. It has 2 syllables, etc. Right? So you give definitions. Okay, so you give things like a heart. I don't know what this is, and so on. So you give definitions, or you show pictures of maybe low frequency items, and then you look at whether you induce a tip of the state tongue. Okay, so many studies looked at this. Okay, so they looked at them. Okay, apps, nepotism, sampan, etc., and you can induce tip of the tongue states in healthy adults. Let's see, I've got a few slides here of all of these empirical findings. So what's interesting is that you have partial access to some of the information. Okay, so the first letter tends to be recorded a lot more. Okay, so this tells you also something about how we store words in our. But the first letter or the first sound is highly salient. We know this. Okay, the first sound. Sometimes more letters. Okay, so more for the last again, this is a known phenomenon in memory. It's called primacy and recency. It's easier to, with good in humans to remember the beginning and the end of any event, no matter how like long an event is or what kind of material. So it's a learning curve. Primacy and recency, things that you learn early. At the beginning of an event, it's kind of like a relationship. The beginning and the end. Okay, and they've done interesting studies also in terms of all kinds of experiences. And there's a little like side note to take from here, which is always make sure, like, if you write an email, to start with something nice and end with something nice, right? And then we can cram the nasty bit in the middle, okay? So a U-shaped curve, and this has to do with general memory processes that were better at encoding the beginning and the end of any linguistic unit or any event. We also know this from speakers with anomia, okay? So this is an experience that usually comes from brain insult, and speakers with anomia are interesting because they manifest an extreme version of what happens to everybody, okay? Simplifying a little bit. Okay, so it might be like an exaggeration of normal tip of the tongue states. And what these tip of the tongue states suggest is that we have, again, this split between the semantics and the phonology. Phonology is harder. Phonological representations, a little bit, they're learned later, phonology, and they are a lot more subject to attrition, like our phonology in some ways, from a representational point of view. I'm going to skip some of these studies. I put them in the slides if you're interested, okay, but I'm just going to go. And I'll get to a point, so why tip of the tongue states and speech errors interesting when, for example, politicians make them. They're very visible, and people are very, very judgmental about why people produce these errors, okay? But from a psycholinguistic point of view, those errors can be totally like benign and not an indication of an impaired thinking. They are an issue having to do with a mapping from thinking to speaking, okay? And very recently, the current president, Joe Biden, actually wasn't the only element, but his speech errors were scrutinized and seen, like read as an indication of poor thinking. But in fact, the errors he made are perfectly understandable psycholinguistically. There's nothing wrong, there's probably something wrong with his speaking, and in fact, Biden was an early stutterer. He had a disfluency, he was a stutterer, right? So something having to do with his speech production, like the timing of his speech, but nothing with his thinking. But we're so used to making these judgments based on how we speak to how we think that it's quite extraordinary that we do that, right? That we know that the thinking and speaking is separate, but at the same time, we make a lot of inferences, especially if somebody doesn't speak well, we think, oh, there's something wrong with their thinking. So one thing I'd like you to take away from this class is to be aware of that bias and to contrast it and say, no, that's how somebody speaks, it's not how they think. So, let me see. I wanted to show you all these speech errors. I wanted to say something. Let me just get the slide about tip of the tongue states, and let me just go here. Okay. Here it was here, sorry. Okay, so there's actually more than one account of why tip of the tongue states occur. Okay, so one idea is that the target, the word that you are trying to retrieve the vaccine for, is actually blocked. So there's a stronger competitor, and you actually retrieve the stronger competitor. And probably next time you're in a tip of the tongue state, reflect on it. Okay, whatever language you're in. So you know the word, it's a word that you know. and it's temporarily you fail to retrieve it. So it could be that something else, you're retrieving a competitor called a blocker or interloper, which is in fact related to the correct target. So we said lemma selection, there's multiple candidates, it's a competitive process that goes on unconsciously, and a competitor received too much activation temporarily, so you're retrieving that one, okay? And it's inhibiting, so it's inhibiting the correct target. Another potential account is that there's only partial activation, so the target is only weakly represented. So here, in fact, your representation is degraded. Okay, and this could be sort of like the idea that this is probably what happens in cases of tip of the tongues that result from brain injury. Right now, you're no longer capable of keeping those phonological representations active long enough. Okay, so partial activation. In normal aging, it is in fact true that older adults, like I think probably you start aging at 30, so they say. Okay, so I mean, when does aging start? Okay, but let's say in the 60s, 70s. So there is more than one account as to why. Okay, so you do in fact observe in older adults more tip of the tongue states, and one idea is that you've got competitors. So older people have larger lexicons. The more experience you have with the world, you know more words. So it's possible that you actually have more competitors, and therefore the reason why in aging you experience multiple tongue states is simplifying, that you know more words. Okay. Another account is this idea that you've got weakened activation through the lexical system, including the phonological network. Okay, so then there's some interesting studies that look at tip of the tongue states in younger versus older adults, and how it is that you can actually get people out of the tip of the tongue state in older versus younger adults. And another area that older adults, and I mean proper names in general are hard, they're difficult. Proper names. Why are proper names difficult? Because they don't correspond to a category. If I say cat, the word cat corresponds to a concept. You know lots of things about cats. If I say, I don't know, the word Louisa, right? Louisa may be that person, my friend Louisa, or whatever, but does not like a category of Louisas. Okay, so this is, proper names are difficult. You know this as interpreters. Proper names are difficult to remember, to encode, and so on. Okay, so in semantic terms, proper names have a reference but not sense. Okay. Because sharing a name, a phonological representation, does not imply sharing a semantic representation. All the Julias are not alike. Okay?
That's why our grandparents always call us by.
That's exactly right. Yes, and there's exactly by each other's names.
Yeah.
And that's also why, and there's actually studies, including a study that looked at why it is that. Like my mom used to call me my cat's name when she hadn't seen me for a while. And that also, there's nothing wrong with that happens, right? There are terms for like people in your household. And that also explains why, for example, when Biden made the mistake of, he said, it was like one president for another, or like, obviously you're a president, and maybe in your previous conversation you'd be talking about presidents, right? You've got your store of the names of presidents, and it's highly likely that you would actually exchange one for another. Okay, so what would not be okay is just instead of using the proper name, you call them like a chair or something like a name, So those kinds of semantic substitutions in the domain of proper names are perfectly benign. Okay. Yeah. Then we've also said, again, for like this idea that we build words, we have constraints and errors, okay? So we said this last week, the week before, so yesterday, the week before, that you've got the span of an error, constraints and errors. Errors are linguistically constrained, they're not just random, it's not like somebody threw a bomb in the production system and it goes haphazard, like syllables exchanging with nouns, no, they're very constrained. So word level errors tend to come from the same syntactic category. Verbs with verbs, nouns with nouns. You don't have nouns switching with verbs. When they do, nouns in English adapt, they become verb-like. Okay, so all of those show you that there's like grammar is pervasive throughout the production system, and the errors that occur, sound errors occur in the same syntactic constituent, are different from errors that occur across phrases in a clause. Okay, and word exchanges happen between phrases, syntagmy, not sentences, phrases, okay, syntactic phrases, whereas sound errors occur locally within the same syntactic constituent. And likewise, in English, stranding errors occur within a constituent that is smaller than a clause. So reflecting different planning stages. This is a picture of Merrill Garrett, who is one of the pioneering psycholinguists in language production. Errors happen frequently, okay, so these are 2.6 per 1,000 sentences, which means 1 per 10,000 words, and words errors about 2 to 4 per 1,000 sentences. So word errors, we said, tend to come from different syntactic constituents, reflecting that function, lemma selection function assignment stage. For example, if I then assign I've selected two lemmas and I know that they express the meaning relationship I'm interested in, but then I switch them and I put the subject in the object slot. Okay, that's in that frame, that sentence frame, compared to sound errors that are local within the same constituent or phrase. You can look at these speech error corpora and explore them, and okay, we tentatively, right? We talked about stranding errors. That means like when the morpheme stays behind, and again, this shows you that you are not retrieving a morphologically inflected word as a whole. You're actually kind of assembling it from its component parts. In this case, the component parts are morphological, so evidence that you're actually doing some kind of morphological decomposition in production. And these errors that are all taken from the Warren book, they are all examples of real, observed, attested speech errors that are in the speech error corpus that I put the link for, so the early collections of speech errors. Back in those days, speech errors were collected extemporaneously, so you just recorded them when they happened, you wrote them down, you wrote down what the intended utterance was, and then what the error was. And then people became less interested in errors because of all kinds of issues. Well, one, they're rare, you can just sit around and like, let's wait for an error to happen, okay? And then experimental methods came in, but then there's another more serious reason, which is this question of observer bias. Maybe you only notice errors that are more visible errors, right? So what's the role of the perceiver in noticing errors? So more recently, speech errors are of interest to phonologists now, because now we have so much digitized material, interviews, shows, and so on. So you actually have the recording, and you know what the context was, and you can then do measurements. You can look at all kinds of things. So you actually have a way of estimating the occurrence of speech errors, because you've got large corpora now. So speech errors have become interesting again, because of reliability issues, like when you have data collection observational methods, you also have this issue if you're just waiting for a speech error to happen and you only record them, you've got a question of bias. But if you can collect a large corpus of spoken speech or conversation and so on, and then look at the errors, then the reliability of the of errors and their classification is circumvented. Okay. Now, our favorite model. Okay, so this is the model that we're working with. The idea that when we lexicalize something, so lexicalization is I'm going from pre-verbal conceptual representation, and this is simply an example, right? It applies to all the words we know. Okay, so these words are easier to use and they're cute. Okay, so example with cats. Okay, so a cat activates all of the rich conceptual knowledge. Ultimately, if we're going to say cat, we're going to select a lemma, which is an abstract representation. In this case, it would be, well, I want to encode the meaning that it's singular and that it's definiteness. Then I retrieve the lexeme, okay? And here I'm representing it in using IPA, and then you phonologically encode it, a cat, then you send it down to articulation. Articulation would be where you also introduce all of those sort of narrow phonetic information, like narrow transcription. Okay, so things that have to do with context, assimilation, and so on. So what if I'm going to say cats? What do I do? Okay, so here I would be again selecting the cat lemma, but this time with a plural diacritic, and then again, two cats, for example, or cats, okay? And the lexeme obviously would be different, two cats, okay? Okay, what about this? What is it? A dog or a puppy, right? Again, same thing. So this is the two-stage in the sense that you're doing it in separate stages. Okay, so lemma, dog, the lexeme, dog, determine a dog, and then a dog in the phonological encoding. So when you're doing at the lexeme level, the representation of the s, the plural, is still abstract. It's basically saying plural morpheme, okay, for cat and for dog. So it's saying cat, dog, plural. And in English, we know that it's s, but then phonologically, when it's phonologically encoded, the allomorph, so the phonological form of that morpheme changes depending on a phonological rule, okay? So when I say to dog, I say, what do I say in English? It's easy, I'm just asking you something easy. And then I'll make it two dogs. Yes, exactly, two dogs. You didn't say two dogs. You said dogs, right? You produced the correct allomorph. So you did that phonological encoding step. So you produced z, not s. Okay, you did it automatically because you're computing this. You got the grammar of English. Okay, so sometimes from errors we know that if you switch, for example, if you said I have two cats, but instead instead of saying cat, I said dog, I would actually end up producing, I would say two dogs, and change the form of the s, okay? Remember yesterday when we were talking about that there was evidence that an error had happened prior to the stage of phonological encoding? It was the error where it was they switching and turning with them. It was they are too tight for you, you are too tight for them. So the person wanted to say, they are too tight for you, but ended up saying you are too tight for them. and we said, oh, the fact that the person produced them in the error, not they, means that the error happened prior to phonological encoding. So for some of these errors, again, you can infer that they're happening prior to phonological encoding when those specific rules, in this case for allomorphy, show up. So here's an example from irregular plurals. Okay, and then we'll finish off probably next week. Now we still have 5 minutes of this issue of morphophonology. Okay, so here's an example error where somebody said, I wanted to say, I'd know one if I heard it. So 2 irregular verbs, know and, sorry, an irregular and irregular. But the person said, I'd hear one if I knew it. The person didn't say knowed it, okay? So again, this error happened prior to the lexeme, prior to phonological encoding. So there's this evidence that you have some representation of the stem plus the abstract morpheme, in this case it would be past. Okay, so here plus past got exchanged with no plus past in error, okay, at an abstract level, but then when the speaker produces it, they actually retrieve new correctly. Okay, again, this type of evidence shows you, was used by Merrill Garrett primarily to say, look, production is staged, because things happen, but even in errors, you can see that this happened before the speaker then phonologically encoded it, okay? So, back in the 80s and 90s, there was this big debate in linguistics, computer science, cognitive science. It's coming back again in the whole with the AI, right? This idea of, okay, how do we represent language? Do we have words and rules, or and is it this abstract vocabulary in our heads, or is it association? Okay, is it purely statistical learning, association? We have no representations for words and rules. This debate is actually back with large language models and AI and so on. So there was, you probably have heard of Steven Pinker, and if you haven't, I recommend that you check him out on YouTube. He's an incredibly brilliant psychologist, psycholinguist, has written a lot about language, and is also a very, very good communicator. So very, very, he's written some. Anybody know or read anything by Steven Pinker? No? Check him out. And so he wrote a book called The Language Instinct in 1994, which was a New York Times bestseller, and it actually explains why some of these questions about, for example, how is it that children learn language? Do we represent words as the stem plus the rule versus do we just learn the whole word as a whole? Interesting from a cognitive point of view, okay? So the question here is, well, how do we compute words that are morphologically complex? Okay, do we store them in the mind as one chunk, or do we actually store them as, okay, verb plus, say, past tense? Okay, so some of the evidence from errors suggests that, well, you kind of do this thing where you have a rule and then you apply it to the stem, okay? And for English, we know we have a set of verbs, regular verbs, that don't follow the pattern, the pattern with a plural, with a regular ed, or with you have a whole host of irregular verbs. And it turns out that regular verbs are more frequent in English, and that's actually the reason why they've stayed irregular, right? Because they're more frequent. That preserves them from being then changed and regularized. And so this question is, well, is there one or two roots for regular and irregular morphology and this question is really a question, it's not so much about verbs, but it really is about how we mentally represent language. Okay, so it was kind of a test case of these kinds of questions. Okay, so it's part of a broader debate, both in psycholinguistics and cognitive science, between connectionist models and symbolic models. We'll finish off with this tomorrow because it's kind of a cute example. And next week, we will also do monitoring and repair. So the chapter by Bach and Levelt, which summarizes the things that we've done so far. Okay, so we'll finish with production. We have a chapter on the use of gesture, and I'm debating, should we talk about gesture or not? Are you interested in co-speech gesture? Yes? So we'll do gesture from the point of view of production, okay? So, and then we'll start with perception, okay? So some of the jargon, it's hard at the beginning. You'll see it, some of the same concepts will come out in comprehension, okay? So it gets easier as you progress. So I will see you next week, and I'll make sure that I've recorded with my friend Canotto. I'm always terrified that it's going to do something. So if I do, no, I'm not sure. Right, I'll figure it out. Why is it so hard? I'm still recording. See, then you can't.
What's it, maybe you have to open the window,
I have to open
the big window.
the big screen there.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the back. Yeah.
Because it's not letting me go anywhere.
There's
Okay.
like more options,
Okay. Yes, condividi. And then, now I do, but I was recording, wasn't I?
Oh.
Uh-oh. Oh no, I wasn't recording, oh no. I thought I was.
maybe.
Interrompi, nascondi.
Oh
no. Oh, oh, I didn't record.
No, wait.
But it looked like it was. Yes, this one is, Okay, so how do I, okay. Panic. Okay, how do I sit, like I want to go out and annulla.
Stop it.